He was home alone when he heard footsteps outside. 3 sharp knocks on the door. Then a loud crash. Robert Ellison, 91, stood up slowly, leaning on his cane. Outside, muffled, aggressive voices were saying things he couldn't understand. When the door was broken down, everything went dark. The hooded men broke into the house, pushed the old man roughly, and locked the windows. One of them turned off the power. Another shouted, "You have an old debt, and you're going to pay it now." Robert didn't react. Fear grew in his chest, but his eyes remained steady. With his body weak on the floor, he did something that few noticed. He pressed a button hidden in his cane. And in that silent moment, something began to change. The intruders dragged him into the kitchen as if he were dead weight. Robert's frail body slammed against the cold floor, and for a second, he thought his heart would fail. He could taste the metallic taste of blood in his mouth, the pain in his shoulders, the distant sound of cruel laughter. One of them kicked his cane away, not knowing what had been triggered seconds before. Another was rummaging through the room, searching for documents, jewelry, anything worth money. But there were only memories, dust, and the smell of stale coffee. Robert, his eyes wet, stared at the picture frame that had fallen from the wall. The picture of his wife, lying on the floor, the glass cracked. The pain he felt was not just physical. It was the weight of seeing his home violated by strangers, of feeling that the world had forgotten who he had been, who he still was inside. If this moment brought back any memories, or made you think of someone in your family, leave a comment. Sometimes, sharing a story can be the beginning of a chain of respect that the world needs. And if this touched you in any way, leave a like. Not because of the numbers, but because it helps this type of story reach more people who also need to hear it. And if you feel that this channel speaks to you, subscribe. With each new story, we give a voice to those who were almost forgotten. Meanwhile, inside that house, Robert's breathing became weaker and weaker. But something outside was already moving. The sound of footsteps echoed like hammers inside Robert's head. Each thud on the floor was a cruel reminder that he was no longer safe in his own home. Locked in his grandchildren's old room, the one where the wallpaper still bore faded children's drawings, he huddled in the wooden armchair, his trembling hands clutching his chest. The air was thick, stifling, and each breath felt like a struggle between his old body and the will to resist. On the other side of the door, furniture could be dragged, drawers ripped out, books torn apart. The intruders seemed to know every corner, every hiding place, as if they were following an invisible map drawn by someone who had been there before. The safe behind his wife's portrait was pried open with a crowbar. Inside were only letters tied together with a faded blue ribbon. They fell to the floor like dry leaves, ignored by hands that did not know the value of what they were tearing up. Robert tried to get up, but his heart gave a harsh warning. A sharp pain pierced his chest like a blade. He fell to his knees, leaning against the bed, his eyes bleary. It was as if time had gone back. In 1952, he had felt a similar pain, the day he received the letter from the hospital saying that his wife had not survived the birth. That memory came back with force, tearing at his chest more than the physical pain. Hearing all this, he knew that today's pain was not just from the bones, but from the memories being desecrated. The invaders shouted among themselves, frustrated at the lack of money. One of them kicked a chair and cursed loudly. The other, with a cynical smile, pulled a sheet of paper from the torn envelope. The deed to the house. "Sign here, old man. It'll save us time." Robert leaned back on the bed, looking up with difficulty. His vision was poor, but he recognized the forged notary seal on the corner of the paper. A cheap forgery, a dirty trick. He sat up with difficulty, his back arched, his eyes tired, but his voice was firm, even if low. "This isn't just land, it's memory." The silence lasted for 2 seconds. Then a mocking laugh filled the room. One of them replied with contempt. "Memory doesn't pay the bills, Grandpa." And he tore the paper from her wrinkled hands violently. It was at that moment that something inside Robert broke. It wasn't his heart, yet. It was the line between resistance and despair. He curled up, pressing his forehead against his knees, trying to block out the sound of the walls being torn apart, the drawers being rummaged through, the history being erased. Everything he had built, all the Sundays on the porch, the letters from his son who hadn't returned from Vietnam, the afternoons Logan had played in the backyard. All of it was being crushed by dirty boots and greedy hands. And the worst thing was the feeling of helplessness. Time had taken away his strength, his vision, his agility. He was a spectator within his own life, but there was something that time had not managed to steal. Memory. And he remembered. He remembered the conversation with Logan 2 years ago. "If something ever happens, Grandpa, press here, on the handle of the cane. No one will see, but I will know." That memory was the only relief, the last hope. Meanwhile, the invader, who appeared to be the leader, tore up the deed and began to write another one, with the false name already filled in. He laughed as he wrote, as if mocking justice itself. Robert, between the pain in his chest and the dizziness that seemed to be growing, held the small wooden radio on the shelf, the same one that played the morning news. But now it was just an empty object, just like him. Have you ever felt like this? Invisible within your own story? Comment here. This doesn't go away. Write this because sometimes a sentence has the power to remind the world that some memories don't give themselves away so easily. And outside, without the attackers noticing, an engine was revving. The wind was raising dust on the dirt road, and a solitary headlight was already approaching the bend. Logan's hands were covered in grease when his phone vibrated. A single notification. No sound, no name, no words. Just real-time coordinates. And that was all it took. His heart raced in a way he hadn't felt since his nights on patrol in Kandahar. That vibration was the silent scream of an old man struggling with what he had left. Memory, courage, and a cane with a secret. He threw the flannel on the seat, grabbed the keys to the armored truck, and didn't think twice. The engine roared loudly. Even after years away from the field, his reflexes returned with frightening ease. His hands were steady on the steering wheel, his eyes fixed on the horizon, and his entire body was ready to react. Because he knew something was very wrong. The route was already in his head. He had drawn it himself, years ago, as a precaution. A narrow dirt road, bordered by cornfields and dry trees, far from the signal, far from help. A place where justice only comes if someone has the courage to bring it. And he was bringing it. Meanwhile, in the house, time seemed to slip away like sand through fingers. Robert no longer knew whether it was day or night. His head throbbed, his body ached, and his dry throat barely let his voice out. The men were now impatient. The leader kicked a chair and shouted, "This old man is stalling! If he doesn't sign, we'll force him to!" One of the others approached with a leather strap in his hand. Robert saw this and backed away with what little strength he had left. His face trembled, but his eyes did not lower. He knew this kind of man. He had seen this cowardice up close, in 1945, in a prison camp in northern Germany, when soldiers took over civilian homes and destroyed history for the sake of sheer power. But now it wasn't war. It was worse. Because this time, no one was going to show up to save him. At least that's what he thought. The pain in his chest returned, and for a moment he thought he was going to faint. His hands lost their strength, and he fell sideways onto the bedroom floor. His head hit the wooden floorboards with a dull thud. He lay there, trying to breathe, as he heard one of the intruders approaching with heavy footsteps. The smell of sweat and cigarettes filled the room, before the door even opened. Outside, Logan was already cutting through an abandoned plantation, cutting short the path. The armored truck, a war relic he had restored piece by piece, moved forward fearlessly, kicking up dust. Memories kept coming back to him. Afternoons with his grandfather on the porch, war stories, advice on honor and dignity. And now all of that was under attack. But it wasn't just Robert he was running for. It was everything the Ellison name stood for. All the promises he made while he was still in uniform. And something bigger. The kind of justice you don't see in the news, but that changes the course of a life. Back at the house, the youngest intruder had entered the room with a glass of water, but it wasn't out of compassion. It was part of a show. He bent down and said in a sarcastic voice, "Here, old man, drink it now and sign it before we lose our patience completely." Robert tried to lift his head. He tried to grab the glass, but his hand didn't respond. It fell again. The water spread across the floor as if marking the time he no longer had. It was at that moment that Logan saw the curve in the road. And when he saw the wooden gate in the distance, something inside him clicked. He turned off the headlights, braked slowly a few feet away, and turned off the engine. Silence was now part of the plan. He stepped out of the vehicle with measured steps, his eyes scanning his surroundings. He grabbed his tactical backpack. There were no firearms inside. There were other tools: flashlights, plastic handcuffs, and an old portrait of Robert. The last photo taken on the porch. Time slowed down. Each step he took brought him closer to a reunion that should never have happened under these circumstances. But at the same time, it gave him the chance to do something few people can do: protect the roots of his own history. From the side of the barn, he saw footprints. 3 different sets. One with fresh marks, fresh mud, uneven weight pattern. Probably the most nervous one, the one running around. Logan analyzed everything as if he were back on a reconnaissance mission. Only this time, there was no backup team, no backup plan. Meanwhile, inside the house, the leader of the group shouted from the hallway, "If he doesn't sign in 5 minutes, I'll tear this deed up in his face myself." Robert, fallen, only whispered incoherent words. His memory was already beginning to fail. He was talking to someone who was no longer there. Perhaps his wife, perhaps his son who never returned from the war. Perhaps he was talking to himself in a desperate attempt to continue existing. The pain was already part of him, as if suffering had taken the place of lucidity. And it was in this state between delirium and pain that he heard outside the sound of different footsteps, lighter, more controlled, and a door being slowly opened. It wasn't one of the men. It couldn't be. Logan had entered, but he didn't make a sound. He didn't shout. He didn't call out. He just walked down the hallway like someone who knew every inch of the floor, like someone who knew exactly where to step so as not to be noticed. And when he saw the first intruder with his back turned, rummaging through the tool cabinet in the side garage, Logan approached with precision. He used a restraining cable to silently immobilize him. In less than 20 seconds, the man was unconscious, trapped, and hiding behind the tarp-covered tractor. No one heard, no one saw, and no one inside had any idea that the hunt had begun. But not in the way they imagined. Write in the comments. Silence can also be justice. There's more to come. And what comes next could change everything. Logan moved like a shadow around the house, his muscles tense, his eyes scanning every corner as if anticipating the worst. The second man had fallen with a thud, and he wasted no time. He used the intruder's own belt to tie him up and dragged the unconscious body behind the large woodshed. Logan's eyes, though cold, were filled with something he hadn't shown in years: emotional urgency. This wasn't a mission. It was personal. It was blood. It was legacy. He approached the kitchen window, his feet sliding across the wooden floor, as if they knew every thorn in the side of the place. Inside, he saw his grandfather lying on the floor, motionless, with half of his face turned to the side, as if he could no longer bear to look at what was happening. A trickle of blood ran from his forehead to his ear. His shirt, open at the chest, revealed his thin body, covered in bruises and bones that were too prominent for someone who had once been so strong. Near him, the third intruder, the most aggressive, was rummaging through the drawers brutally, throwing pans on the floor, breaking plates, stepping on the old letters that had escaped from the destroyed box. Logan held his breath. His eyes filled with tears for a moment, but he blinked quickly. He couldn't let his emotions take over now. The pain would come later. Now was the time for strategy, for decision. The kind of truth that isn't taught in books. Either you act or you watch everything fall apart. And he wasn't there to watch. He walked around the side of the house, through a half-open laundry room door, and down the hallway without a sound. A creak of wood under his feet made him stop. The intruder on the other side glanced at the bedroom door and pointed his gun. Logan froze. It was a split second that separated tragedy from justice. And that split second lasted long enough. The man shouted, "Is anyone there?" Logan pushed the door open with his shoulder. The gun went off. The noise echoed throughout the house. A picture fell from the wall. The bullet went through the wall next to it, but Logan was already down. With a quick movement, he threw one of the plastic handcuffs at the attacker's face, unbalancing him. He ran straight ahead, grabbed the armed arm, spun it around hard, and brought him to the ground with a thud so loud that the wood shook. The man struggled, tried to fight back, but Logan applied a precise arm lock. The scream was muffled by a cloth thrown over his mouth. He used his knee to immobilize him and secured his hands with the last remaining handcuff. The invader was still struggling, but it was only a matter of time. Logan stood up with his chest heaving, his eyes fixed on Robert, who remained on the ground. A deep silence took over the room. It was the kind of silence that comes not from peace, but from the pause between pain and awareness. He ran to his grandfather, knelt down beside him, and gently touched his shoulder. "Grandpa, it's me. I'm here." Robert opened his eyes with difficulty. His gaze was distant, as if he were between this world and some older one, made of memories and losses. But when he heard the voice, he blinked, recognized it. "Logan? It's me, yes. It's okay now. They won't hurt you anymore." Robert tried to smile, but his mouth didn't respond. He raised one of his trembling hands and gripped his grandson's wrist with surprising strength for someone in his condition. "You really came. I promised, didn't I?" Robert's breathing was short and ragged. He coughed, and dark spots appeared on his hand. Logan understood. He needed medical help, urgently. But first, he needed to make sure everything here was safe. He stood up, picked up the discarded phone on the floor, and dialed 911. As he waited for the connection, he looked around and saw the trail of destruction. The furniture was destroyed, the pictures were broken, the floor was marked by dirty footprints. Everything that made the house a home had been violated. But the heart of the story still beat. Faintly, but it beat. The operator's voice came on the line. Logan spoke calmly, giving the address, explaining the situation in precise, almost military detail. He asked for an ambulance. He asked for police backup. He asked for silence, because he knew that what had just happened there was no ordinary case. It was a turning point, a before and after. A story that would change everything. He walked back to Robert, pulled up a chair, and sat down next to the old man. His grandfather's eyes were open, staring at the ceiling, as if trying to make sense of what was left. Logan held his hand firmly, like someone anchoring a ship in a storm. "Do you remember the porch, Grandpa? Our last conversation there." Robert blinked slowly. A barely perceptible yes. "That's right. We're going to sit there again. There's a lot of tea to drink and a lot of conversation to finish." A tear fell from Robert's eyes, and this time he didn't try to hide it. Outside, in the distance, the sound of sirens began to emerge, cutting through the silence of that forgotten road. But inside the house, there was something stronger than any emergency signal. The certainty that, when everything seemed lost, someone still had enough courage to fight until the end. Write in the comments, "I believe in that kind of courage." Because stories like this aren't just about violence or revenge. They're about choices. About who we decide to be when no one else is looking. The bedroom door slammed against the wall with violence. The dull sound of the impact made the intruder jump around, his gun already raised, his eyes wide, but it was too late. Logan entered like a bolt of lightning, not as a grandson, but as a soldier. But his trained body moved with surgical precision, dodging the barrel of the gun, grabbing the attacker's arm tightly and twisting it until the crack of the bone breaking mixed with the muffled cry of pain. The man fell to his knees, and Logan, as silently as he had arrived, immobilized him with his knee in the back, using the tape from his own belt to secure his wrists. For long seconds, all that could be heard was their heavy breathing. And then, in the corner of the room, a frail figure trembled. Robert was still on the floor, his face sweaty, his shirt torn across his chest, his eyes clouded with fear and exhaustion. But when he saw Logan there, kneeling before him, his hands dirty from fighting and his chest heaving, something settled in his gaze. It was no longer despair. It was relief. It was a kind of emotional surrender that only happens when pain begins to give way to safety. Logan approached, picked up a blanket that had fallen from the armchair, and carefully covered his grandfather's body. He didn't say anything. He didn't need to. Robert didn't speak either. He just lightly squeezed his grandson's wrist as if to say, "You saved more than my life." It was the language of someone who had seen a lot in the world and learned that at certain times, silence is worth more than any rehearsed phrase. But what no one saw was what Logan was discreetly holding in his pocket. A small blue ribbon he had found among the torn letters on the floor. It was the same ribbon that had held together the love letters between Robert and his wife in the 1950s. That ribbon, stained with dust and stained by time, was now back in the family's hands. A small symbol, but full of emotional weight. It was more than just paper. It was proof that the roots of that house still existed, despite everything. Outside, the sound of sirens finally began to draw nearer. But Logan knew. Official justice always came too late. What mattered had already happened inside. The scene was chaos. Broken furniture, torn books, the smell of blood and old wood. But strangely, there was peace. He dragged the unconscious attacker into the hallway, where the other two were already tied up, unconscious. He lined them all up against the wall of the room. Then, with slow steps, he returned to Robert and helped him to his feet. The old man could barely keep his balance, but he did not refuse the support. With his arm around his grandson's shoulder, they walked together to the porch of the house. The sun was just beginning to rise behind the dry trees on the road. The light mist of dawn still covered part of the field, as if nature was also trying to hide the ravages of the night. They sat down. The old man in the rocking chair, Logan beside him, in silence. For a moment, they just breathed, just existed. Robert looked at his grandson and tried to joke. "You still drive like a madman." Logan laughed for the first time in hours. "Even better than you drove that blue beetle." The old man smiled, his eyes brimming with tears, but there was pride there. A silent pride, the kind that only veterans understand, of having fought, of having survived, and of having instilled in someone the courage to continue what he had started. And then the patrol car stopped. 2 doors opened. The county sheriff got out first, adjusting his hat, looking suspicious. When he saw the 3 men on the floor, tied up and unconscious, and then Robert in the chair with Logan next to him, he took off his hat and said, "Mr. Ellison, what happened here?" Robert looked at Logan, who just shrugged. "Family." That was all. But it was enough. The sheriff nodded, as if he recognized a hidden truth behind the words. Because in that house, that morning, something had happened that could not be recorded in a report. A kind of silent agreement between the past and the present. A rescue that went beyond the physical. The medical team arrived next, and Logan insisted that they examine his grandfather first. Robert resisted a bit, as all old-school men do, but he didn't argue much. He knew his body needed care, and that his heart, though tired, was still beating strong inside. Because when someone you love shows up at the exact moment when all seems lost, something inside your soul is kindled anew. And even though the night had left deep marks on the walls and on the skin, something about that morning felt renewed, as if everything had been torn away, to make room for something stronger. Write in the comments, when the roots are strong, the house stands strong. Because what happened there wasn't just an attack. It was proof that there are bonds that neither time, nor fear, nor violence can destroy. And that isn't over yet. The sound of sirens still echoed down the road when the neighbors began to emerge from their homes, one by one, with suspicious steps and sidelong glances. Some came out of curiosity, others out of silent shame for not having done anything when the screams came from the old mansion. But there, on the weather-worn porch, Robert sat as if he were part of the structure, wrapped in a blanket, his body trembling and his eyes wide open, seeing more than the present. Logan stood to the side, arms crossed, staring at the police officers who were getting out of their cars. The sheriff, a middle-aged man with a face marked by decades of omission disguised as prudence, walked slowly towards the invaders, all of them immobilized, gagged, covered in dirt and defeat. He stopped for a few seconds, analyzing the scene, trying to understand what had really happened there. But he didn't ask. He didn't need to. The image said it all. Robert coughed lightly. The nurse who was with him came over, checked his symptoms, and exchanged a few quick words with the paramedic, but he refused to be taken away at that moment. He said he still needed to see the sun rise properly, even though he was burning with fever, and his blood pressure was slowly dropping. Logan respected this. He knew that the old man had a resistance that could not be measured with machines. It was another kind of strength. Older, rawer, quieter. The police surrounded the place, picking up the invaders one by one. None of them put up any resistance. There was nothing more to be said. That house had swallowed them up and spat them out again. The police car drove off slowly, while the neighbors stood motionless on the sidewalks, their expressions a mix of regret and reverence. The sheriff walked back to the porch and watched Logan for a few seconds. He was holding his grandfather's cup of tea, cooling in his hands, his eyes fixed on some distant point, until the sheriff said, "This kind of thing changes the way we look at the world, right?" Logan replied, without taking his eyes off the road. "It changes everything. Even silence takes on a different sound afterwards." And deep inside, he knew. This wasn't just the end of an attack. It was the turning point of a journey. Something profound had moved in that house. Something that didn't fit into reports or make the evening news. The sky was already light when Logan walked back into the house. The wood still creaked beneath his feet. The walls still carried the smell of the invasion. And the living room felt emptier than ever. But there was a different energy in the air, as if every object on the floor said, "We're still here." He knelt down to pick up the letters from the floor. Some were torn, others stained. But among them, one caught his attention. It was an old letter, in his grandmother's handwriting, dated 1960. Inside it was a folded note with a handwritten sentence. "A home is only a home, as long as there is love in it. If one day it is gone, rebuild it with what you have." Logan swallowed. He hadn't known his grandfather still had it. Maybe he didn't even know the letter still existed. But now it made sense. Every decision he had made. Every memory he had protected. Every choice not to sell the property. Robert wasn't resisting out of stubbornness. He was resisting out of love. Love for a memory that time had failed to erase. He picked up an empty box and began to gather what was left. The torn photos, the family portraits, the old cane. One by one, item by item, like piecing together a shattered soul. At the back of the shelf, he found a rusty military coin, one of those given to veterans who completed critical missions. It was the same one his grandfather had worn on a necklace back in the day, before he'd hidden it among old books. Logan held it for a moment, ran his fingers over the inscriptions, and then wordlessly slipped it into his pocket. Later, as Robert slept on the couch, wrapped in blankets and well-earned peace, Logan sat beside him, watching the old man breathe heavily. Each breath was a reminder of the fragility of life, but also of the strength in not giving up. Because despite everything, the loneliness, the violence, the time, that house survived. That story survived. And when he got up, it wasn't to leave. It was to walk to the back of the property, where the shed still stood, covered in leaves and rust. He forced open the doors and stepped inside. Inside, the smell was the same as it had been decades ago. Damp wood, old grease, aged paper. In one corner, the bicycle he had ridden as a child. In the other, a toolbox hung, untouched. And above it, a black and white photo, hanging from a rusty nail. Logan at 10, in a military helmet, standing next to Robert. Both of them wearing identical smiles. He stood there for a moment, silent. Then he closed his eyes and took a deep breath. This wasn't just a warehouse. It was a sanctuary, a place of transformation, where memories weren't just memories, but fuel for future decisions. When he left, the sun was already high. The house seemed less damaged. Or maybe it was just that he was beginning to see it with different eyes. Comment here. There are things that time cannot erase, because sometimes what resists is not the structure. It is the history it holds. And there is still more to come. Steam rose slowly from the cup, dancing in the air as if time had stopped there. The sun was already reaching the roof of the porch, painting the old planks where so many stories had been told, and so many others silenced gold. Robert raised the cup to his lips with both hands, trembling a little, but steady enough not to spill. The aroma of the tea was the same as always, but the taste, this one seemed different, more alive. Logan stared at him in silence. His eyes were still wet, as if part of him still couldn't believe that his grandfather was there, whole, breathing, smiling, even after everything. The blanket was still wrapped around him like a shield against the night before, and even though his body was marked by fatigue, there was something new about Robert. An expression of peace that Logan hadn't seen in a long time. "The chair still creaks in the same place," said the old man, rocking slightly from side to side. "You were the one who taught her how to do that," Logan replied with a subtle smile. The silence between them was not discomfort. It was reverence. Here, on that worn porch, too many words would have been a waste. Every gesture carried a story, every pause, a meaning, and even the creaking of the wood seemed to say, "You survived." Robert stared at the yard with long eyes, the same yard where he taught his children to plant, where he played ball with his grandchildren, where he buried the pet dog that had lived with the family for 13 years. Every corner had a name, an echo, a memory, but also an absence. He sighed, as if leafing through the past. You know, I've prepared myself many times to die in this house, but I never thought that living another day here would hurt so much. Logan didn't answer right away. He just closed his eyes and nodded, as if he understood without needing to explain. Because that sentence said more about transformation than any sermon. His grandfather's pain wasn't just physical. It was the pain of having to defend his own memory with his last bit of strength, of seeing everything he had built almost lost, and still standing. But the truth is that we don't lose everything all at once, right? Robert added, stirring the tea slowly. We lose it little by little. The photo that disappears from the shelf, the name that they forget to mention, the street that changes its name. What Logan saw there was not fragility. It was courage. The courage of someone who grows old without screaming. Of someone who accepts loneliness as part of the process, but doesn't stop loving because of it. And then, in an almost automatic gesture, Logan took from his pocket the military coin he had found the day before, now clean and carefully polished. He held it out to his grandfather, who took a moment to focus his eyes. When he recognized it, his wrinkled hand closed around it with a firm grip. "I thought I had lost it. I think she was just waiting for the right time to come back." Robert was silent. Then he held up the coin, looked at it against the light, and laughed with his nose. "This here is just metal. But for those who understand, it is worth more than gold." Logan knew it wasn't about the object. It was about what it represented. Mission accomplished. Cycle closed. A story that had almost been erased, but was now breathing again. Later, the street was full again. But this time, with life. Children ran past on their bikes. An elderly couple, who had barely greeted Robert from the sidewalk before, stopped to ask if he needed anything. The neighbor next door left a loaf of cornbread wrapped in a clean cloth. It was as if the neighborhood was also trying to redeem itself, to relearn how to value what it had almost let slip away. And then something unexpected happened. A group of young people from the local high school, led by a history teacher, appeared at the fence. They were holding papers, cameras, and an interview folder. One of them approached with some trepidation and asked, "Mr. Ellison, would you let us record a little of your story? We want to do a project about the veterans of the region." Robert looked at Logan. Logan looked at Robert. Neither of them said anything for a few seconds. Then the old man adjusted the blanket around his shoulders and struggled to his feet. "Only if you promise one thing." "What?" asked the boy. "Tell everything, not just what seems nice. Tell what hurts too, because there are stories that, if we soften them, become lies." The boy smiled, nodding, and at that moment, with the cane in one hand and the coin in the other, Robert crossed the gate. The porch was empty, but not silent, because sometimes it is the moment someone stands up that the world understands that it still has a lot to hear. Write in the comments, "This story deserves to be told." Because there are legacies that never die. They just wait for the right moment to come back to life. If you've come this far, it's because this story spoke to some part of you. Maybe it reminded you of someone in your family, or you simply recognize the value of things that time almost erases, but that we need to keep alive. If this type of content resonates with you, subscribe to the channel. Here, we tell stories that the world tends to ignore, but that deserve to be remembered. Stories that touch, that transform, and that leave something in us even after the video ends. Leave your like if at any point you felt like you were there on that balcony with them, because that helps this message reach more hearts. And comment below. I stayed until the end because it was worth every second, just so I know who really walked with me this far. There's a video here that continues in the same vein, full of emotion, twists and turns, and humanity. Click on it and stay with me there. The next story might also leave an impression on you.